I want to tell you about the exact moment my marriage ended, because I have replayed it so many times I could draw you a floor plan of our kitchen with my eyes closed, the grey stone island, the 2 mugs I hadn't washed from breakfast, the manila envelope Jin-ho set down between them like it was just another piece of mail. "Sign it before my mother gets here," he said. "Please, Simone." He didn't look at me when he said it. That was the part that told me he meant it. I opened the envelope with my thumb because some part of me refused to believe I needed a letter opener for the end of my own marriage. Divorce petition. My name spelled correctly, which somehow made it worse. A blank line where my signature was supposed to go, and beside it, in the corner, a single clause I didn't understand yet, a clause referencing the estate of Yoon Dae-sung, his father, who had been dead exactly 11 days. "You buried your father a week and a half ago," I said, "and this is what you drove home to give me." "I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" He didn't answer. And 3 floors above us, in a house I had lived in for 3 years and never once been given a key to the West Wing, someone had already decided what my life was going to look like without asking me a single question about it. I am a crisis negotiator. I have talked armed men into putting guns on the floor. I have sat across from executives mid-collapse and told them, calmly, exactly what they didn't want to hear. I know what it looks like when a person is choosing their words to keep me calm instead of to tell me the truth. My husband was doing that to me, in our own kitchen, and I had no idea yet how far the lie went. The car was already outside before I'd finished reading the 2nd page. Madame Yoon's driver, black suit, eyes forward, like he'd been told not to look at me. I stood in the doorway of the house I'd renovated with my own hands, the reading nook, the herb garden Jin-ho pretended to hate and secretly watered before sunrise so I'd never catch him doing it, and I understood, in the specific, physical way you understand a diagnosis, that I was being erased from a life I had built in real time while it was still standing. 3 years earlier, I had walked into this family the way I walk into every room clear-eyed, prepared for resistance, willing to earn my place instead of assuming it. Jin-ho had been the first man I'd ever met whose confidence didn't require me to make myself smaller to stand next to it. I remembered our 2nd date, a diner at 2 in the morning after I'd talked a man off a parking structure ledge for 6 hours straight, and how Jin-ho had simply ordered me eggs and waited, no questions, until I was ready to speak. That patience was the thing I'd married. I was standing in the doorway of our house trying to reconcile that man with the one who'd just handed me an envelope like a foreclosure notice. Madame Yoon came in without knocking. She had never knocked in 3 years. She looked at the envelope on the counter, then at me, and something in her face that might have been relief made my stomach drop harder than the papers had. "You'll sign it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Will I? You have no idea what is coming for this family, Simone. My son is trying to keep you out of it." Then let him tell me that, in words, looking at me. She turned to Jin-ho instead of answering me, and that the turning away, the practiced ease of a woman used to being obeyed, was the first thing that didn't fit. Grieving mothers don't move that fast. Grieving mothers don't already have signature witnesses standing by the car. Drop your city in the comments if you've ever had someone decide what was best for you without asking. I want to know where you're reading this from. I didn't sign anything that night. I told them I needed a lawyer's eyes on it first, true, and also the only sentence I had that would buy me time. Jin-ho didn't argue. He just watched me fold the papers back into the envelope with a look I hadn't seen on him since the week we met, when he still thought I might refuse him entirely. I should have recognized it. It was the look of a man who already knew he'd lost something and hadn't figured out yet that it was me. I went to work the next morning because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Halfway through a call with a client whose merger was unraveling over a leaked memo, I caught myself giving him advice I couldn't take myself. Don't sign anything under a deadline someone else set for you. The deadline is usually the manipulation, not the document. I said it to a stranger on a conference line with total conviction, and then sat in the silence after the call, staring at my own reflection in a dark monitor, understanding exactly how far I was from following my own counsel. 2 of my junior associates asked, carefully, if everything was all right. I told them I was fine. It was the first lie I told that week, and it sat wrong in my mouth the whole rest of the day, because I had built a career on believing that the people who say, "I'm fine" fastest are usually the ones who most need someone to refuse to believe them. Nobody in that office pushed. I didn't blame them. I hadn't given anyone permission to. I didn't go to a lawyer that week. I went to Priya. Priya Desai had been my second at the firm for 6 years, ever since I left the Bureau's crisis unit to build something that let me sleep in my own bed more than 4 nights a month. She read people's silences for a living, same as me, which meant she read mine the second I sat down across from her with the envelope still creased from my coat pocket. "He handed it to you," she said. "Not his lawyer. Him. On the counter. Like a takeout menu." "That's not how guilty men do it, Simone." She turned the papers over, scanning the boilerplate. "Guilty men send lawyers. Ashamed men avoid the room." This, she tapped the signature line. This is a man doing something he's been told to do. I wanted to argue with her. I wanted, badly, for it to simply be true that my husband didn't want me anymore, because that was a wound I already knew how to survive. What Priya was suggesting, that someone else had put the pen in his hand, was a different kind of wound. It meant I hadn't lost him. It meant someone had taken him, in a house full of people who called me family at dinner, and something else behind closed doors. "There's a clause here," Priya said. Page 4. Referencing his father's estate. Divorce petitions don't usually cite a third party's will. I hadn't gotten that far. I read it now, twice, and felt the floor tilt half an inch under me. The petition wasn't just ending my marriage. It was timed. Structured to finalize 9 days from the date on the envelope, 1 day before Dae-sung Yoon's will was scheduled to be read to the family council. Someone wanted me gone before that room opened. "I need to see the will," I said. "You're not on the distribution list. You know that." I didn't ask if I was on the list. I asked how to see it. Priya looked at me for a long moment, the way she does right before she agrees to something she knows we'll both regret if it goes wrong. "Then we do this carefully," she said. "Because if I'm right about what's underneath this, whoever wrote that clause is not going to enjoy being caught." I went back to the estate that Friday. Not because I'd decided to sign, but because I am not a woman who runs from a room just because someone wants me out of it. Dinner that night was smaller than usual. Madame Yoon, Jin-ho, Tae-yang, and me, the 4 of us circling a table that could have seated 14. Everyone's silverware too loud against the china. Tae-yang Yoon had always been polite to me in the specific, careful way men are polite to something they've already decided doesn't belong in the room. He asked about my firm's caseload. He asked whether I found it difficult, in my line of work, to trust anyone at all, given how much of it was built on reading lies for a living. I told him that was exactly why I trusted very few people, and watched something flicker behind his eyes before it smoothed back into courtesy. "The board meets Tuesday," he said, to Jin-ho, not me. "It would be cleaner, procedurally, if matters were settled before then." "Matters," I repeated. "The estate," he said, smiling at me now, thin and correct. "Grief makes families vulnerable to challenge, Simone. Surely you understand that, professionally. The board will look for any instability to exploit. A marriage in transition invites scrutiny none of us want. Then let's not have a marriage in transition," I said. "Let's have one that's simply still married." He didn't answer that. He looked at Jin-ho instead, the same way Madame Yoon had turned away from me in the kitchen, like I was a problem to be managed around rather than a person at the table. And I filed that look away with everything else I was starting to collect. Afterward, in the east hallway, Jin-ho found me outside the door that had always been locked to the records room, his father's private archive, where 3 generations of Yoon contracts, deeds, and family history lived behind a door only the head of the family carried a key to. "You shouldn't be up here," he said, and for a second his voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with authority. "Why did you give me those papers yourself, Jin-ho? Because I owed you that much. You owe me the truth." "That's not the same thing." He looked at the locked door behind me like it had eyes. "There are people in this family who think you're a liability, not because of anything you've done, because of what you'd become once the will is read." "What does that mean?" "It means I need you gone from the paperwork before Tuesday. After that, I can protect you properly. I promise you, this is the only way I know how to. Don't." My voice came out flatter than I meant it to, the negotiator's voice, the one I use when I need someone to hear me over their own panic. "Don't tell me this is protection. I have spent my career talking people out of decisions made from fear dressed up as love. I know what this sounds like from the inside of the room. It sounds exactly like this." He didn't have an answer for that. He turned and walked away from me down his own hallway, in his own house, like a man being chased by something I couldn't see yet. I stood there a long moment, hand flat against the cold wood of the records room door, and made a decision that would define the rest of this story. I was not going to wait for my husband to decide how much of the truth I was allowed. I went home that night to a house that still had my clothes in the closet and my coffee order written on a sticky note in Jin-ho's handwriting on the fridge, and I sat on the floor of our bedroom for a long time, doing something I almost never let myself do, which was admit out loud to no one that I was frightened. Not of losing the marriage, of the specific, familiar shape of what was happening to me, a room full of people deciding what was best for me while I stood close enough to hear it and too far to stop it. I had built an entire career on refusing to let that happen to strangers in stairwells and boardrooms. I had never once turned that same refusal on my own family. My training supervisor at the bureau used to say the hardest hostage to negotiate for is the one who's been taught her whole life that staying quiet is a form of strength. I had spent 3 years in that house being praised for exactly that kind of quiet, composed, unbothered, never the one who made a scene at dinner. I understood, sitting on that floor, that the quiet had cost me. It had made it easy for an entire family to assume I would absorb whatever they decided and call it grace. I was done calling it grace. Mr. Han had worked for the Yoon family for 31 years. He'd let me into the kitchen garden the first week I moved in, when I was too proud to admit I was homesick for dirt under my fingernails, and he'd never once treated me like I was borrowed time in that house. I found him polishing silver in the pantry 2 days later. "I need to see the will," I said, no preamble, because Mr. Han respected directness more than performance, or whatever room it's kept in. He didn't ask why. That, more than anything, told me he already suspected what I did. "Mr. Dae-sung changed his instructions 8 months before he passed," he said, low, not looking up from the silver. "I was the one who filed the amendment. He asked me not to speak of it. But he also told me if anyone in this house ever came to me frightened and asking, I should not lie to her. Was he expecting me? He was expecting someone to need protecting. He didn't say who." Mr. Han finally met my eyes. "The records room key lives in his study, in the second drawer of the desk, under a false bottom he thought only I knew about. I will not open that door for you, Mrs. Yoon. But I will not stop you either." He paused, hands still on the silver, and added something I didn't understand until much later. "Mr. Dae-sung didn't trust easily. He trusted you within a year. That is not nothing in this family." I want you to sit with that word for a second, protecting, because it is going to mean 2 completely different things by the end of this story. And the gap between those 2 meanings is where everything that happened to my marriage actually lives. The records room smelled like paper and cedar and 40 years of secrets nobody had aired out. I found the amended will in a sealed folder dated 8 months before Dae-sung's death, and I read it standing up, because I didn't trust myself to sit down and stay calm. He hadn't left the organization's leadership to Jin-ho outright. He'd left it in trust, structured so that operational control passed to whoever held Jin-ho's marriage license at the time of the reading, alongside him, as co-signatory on every major asset. Not a courtesy title. A legal safeguard, written by a dying man who apparently understood something about his own family that his son hadn't wanted to say to my face. That Jin-ho, alone, would be pressured, isolated, and picked apart by the people around him unless there was someone in the room who couldn't be maneuvered. There was a second document in the folder, handwritten, dated the same day. A letter. I recognized my father-in-law's cramped, formal script from the birthday cards he used to leave on my pillow. The ones that always said something short and true instead of something sentimental. This one read, "My son loves with his whole hand and none of his judgment. Whoever he marries will need to be someone who can hold both of those things steady when I am no longer here to." If you are reading this, I believe I found her. I had to sit down after that, false bottom or not. There was one more item in the folder, a ledger page, older. The ink faded to brown. A record of a nearly identical maneuver 11 years earlier, before I had ever met Jin-ho. A separation filing drawn up against Dae-sung's own younger sister and her husband, timed to strip her of standing before a different family transition, quietly vetoed by Dae-sung himself when he discovered who had drafted it. The name on that decade-old filing was the same name signing off on half the current security division's expense reports. Taeyang had learned this particular move from somewhere. He hadn't invented it. He'd inherited it, the way some families inherit silver instead of scars. Dae-sung-yoon had built a door into his own will with my name behind it, whether I wanted the room or not. And 9 days from now, someone in this family was trying to make sure I wasn't married to his son when that door opened. I thought about the divorce papers on our kitchen counter, timed to finalize 1 day early. I thought about the driver who was already outside before I'd finished the second page. I thought about the relief on Madame Yoon's face, and I understood, with the particular cold clarity that comes right before a negotiation turns, that I had been looking at the wrong villain in my own kitchen. Jin-ho hadn't been trying to hurt me. Somebody had convinced him that letting me go was the only way to save me. Drop the one word that describes how you'd feel finding that out. I want to see it in the comments before you keep reading, because I promise you, it gets worse before it gets better. The voice recording was Priya's idea. She'd been quietly auditing the security firm's access logs for the estate's private network a favor, she called it, though we both knew it wasn't legal in the strictest sense, and neither of us cared. What she found was a call routed through the estate's internal line 4 days before Jin-ho handed me those papers. Caller: Tae-yang-yoon, Jin-ho's cousin, head of the family's security division since Dae-sung's stroke 2 years back. Recipient: Jin-ho. She played 11 seconds of it for me in her office, the only clean segment the log had captured before the line dropped to encrypted static. Tae-yang's voice, tight and urgent. If she's still your wife when the lawyers open that folder, you hand her a knife pointed at your own throat. You do this now, cousin, or I do it for you. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. He's not protecting the family, I finally said. He's protecting his own claim. There's more, Priya said. I pulled the property registry on the Incheon warehouse complex, the one under dispute with the Osan family. Tae-yang's been quietly negotiating with them independently for 6 weeks, without board authorization. If your father-in-law's will puts you and Jin-ho in joint control, that deal dies. If it's just Jin-ho, alone, grieving, isolated from the one person who might ask the right questions, Tae-yang thinks he can walk it through unopposed. Priya's audit almost cost her the access she needed to finish it. On the second night, the estate's IT contractor flagged an unfamiliar query against the security archive and rerouted it to Tae-yang's office for review before Priya managed to spoof the request back through a maintenance ticket she'd filed under a fake vendor account 2 weeks earlier, a trick she'd learned doing due diligence on hostile takeovers long before either of us worked cases with this much at stake. We didn't sleep much that week. I remember standing in her kitchen at 4 in the morning, the two of us passing a single legal pad back and forth, building the timeline the way I'd build a hostage negotiator's whiteboard: call times on the left, decisions on the right, every gap between them, a question we still owed an answer to. He needs Jin-ho weak, I said, laying the pieces out across Priya's desk like a hand of cards I hadn't decided how to play yet. And he needs me gone. So what do we do with all this? We don't hand it to Jin-ho, I said, surprising myself with how sure I was. Not yet. If I bring him proof his cousin manipulated his father's grief, he'll want to handle it privately, quietly, the same way he handled the divorce, protecting everyone from the truth instead of trusting them with it. I need him to hear it in a room he can't manage his way out of. I thought about the forgery of a marriage, not a forged signature. Nothing so clean as that, but a forged fear. Someone had reached into my husband's grief and planted a story in it. That loving me meant removing me. That was the manipulation. Not a lie about facts. A lie about what love was supposed to look like under pressure. And Jin-ho had believed it, because it was dressed in the one language he'd been raised to trust without question: family duty, dressed up as devotion. I confronted him that night in the study, the same room where I'd found the false-bottomed drawer. He was standing at the window with a drink he hadn't touched, and when he turned to look at me, I saw exhaustion carved so deep into his face that for one unguarded second, I almost softened before I remembered I had come there to be honest, not comfortable. I know about Tae-yang's call, I said. I know about the warehouse deal he's running behind your back. I know he told you divorcing me was the only way to keep me safe. And I need you to hear how that sounds out loud, because I don't think you've said it out loud to yourself yet. His jaw tightened. You went into the records room. Yes! That room is not yours to enter. Your father disagreed. I set the amended will on the desk between us. the way he'd set the divorce papers between us 9 days earlier and watched something in his face come apart at the seams. He built a clause into his will with my name in it 8 months before he died, Jin-ho. He knew this family would come for whoever stood next to you. And your cousin has spent the last 2 weeks making sure that when the lawyers open that folder, I'm not standing there. That's not. He stopped. Started again, quieter. He told me the board was going to challenge the marriage's legitimacy if you were still listed as my spouse, that they'd use it to stall the transition, tie us up in family court for years while Osan moved on the warehouse contracts. He said the only clean way through was to end it on paper, quietly, before the reading, and that once the dust settled, we could remarry. Privately. No one would ever have to know it happened. And you believed that a man who needed your grief to be useful was telling you the truth. He didn't answer. I watched him replay it, really replay it. Maybe for the first time the calls, the urgency, the specific way Taeyang had never once let him sit with the decision long enough to ask a second question. I was trying to protect you, he said finally, and his voice had lost all its certainty. I thought if I could just get you clear of the paperwork before the fight started, none of it could touch you. You didn't protect me, Jin-ho. You isolated me. There's a difference, and I need you to learn it, because I am not going to spend the rest of whatever this is being managed instead of trusted. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the drink he still hadn't touched in a slow circle on the desk. My father used to say the head of this family has to decide things alone, quickly, before the decision decides itself. I think I heard that my whole life and never once asked him what it cost him to believe it. What did it cost him? You, he said. In a way. He almost didn't tell my mother about the will amendment either, before Mr. Han talked him out of it. He told me that, once, right before he got too sick to say much of anything clearly. I didn't understand until tonight why he'd bothered mentioning it at all. What do you want me to do? I want you to go to your cousin yourself. Tonight. Tell him you know. Watch what he does when he thinks the only person in his way is you. He came back an hour later, and I knew before he said a word that it had gone badly, because it was supposed to. He didn't deny it, Jin-ho said, sitting down across from me like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. He said I should be thanking him. He said the will was a mistake my father made in the last confused months of his illness, that a company can't survive being run by a man distracted by a marriage the board never fully accepted, and that if I loved this family at all, I'd let him finish what he'd started. Did he threaten you? He said if I brought this to the council before Tuesday, he'd make sure everyone in that room remembered exactly how unstable my judgment has looked since my father died. He's not wrong that they'll be watching for weakness. He's just wrong about where the weakness is. I watched him say that last part, and understood we had reached the hinge of this whole story, the moment where a man either keeps managing the people he loves to spare them a fight, or finally lets them stand in the fight next to him. Then we don't give him a quiet room to work in, I said. We give him the biggest one in the house. The night before the council session, Jin-ho paced our bedroom for an hour, rehearsing what he'd say, unraveling a little further with every version. I finally sat him down and did the thing I do for terrified executives twice a month for a living. I made him stop talking about what he was afraid Taeyang would say and start talking, in order, about what was true. You don't need a speech, I told him. You need 3 sentences you can say without your voice shaking, and then you need to let the evidence do the rest of the work. That's not weakness. That's how you win a room that's already decided to doubt you. And if my mother sides with him? Then she sides with him in front of a table full of people holding documents that say otherwise, and she'll have to live with that choice in daylight instead of a hallway. I took his hand, the first time I'd done that without thinking since the night with the envelope. I'm not walking in there to save you, Jin-ho. I'm walking in there because it's my house too, and I want to watch you decide, once, in front of everyone, which one of us you actually trust. He didn't sleep much either. Neither did I. But when morning came, he put on the same charcoal suit he'd worn to his father's funeral, and I understood he meant it as its own kind of statement that whatever happened in that chamber, he intended to answer for it as his father's son, not his cousin's tool. He didn't apologize that night. Not fully. I think some part of him was still trying to work out how much of his father's death he'd been too grief-blind to see clearly, and how much of it Taeyang had engineered on purpose. But he didn't ask me to sign the papers again either. That was its own kind of answer. What he did instead, 3 days before the will was set to be read, was worse for him and better for us. He called a full family council session, early, and told them he wanted the will read in front of everyone, no private pre-briefings, no closed-door conversations with legal counsel first, the way Taeyang had quietly arranged. Madame Yoon resisted at first. "Your father wanted a quiet transition," she told him, the morning of both of us standing in the same kitchen where this had started. "Not a spectacle!" "My father wanted the truth to survive him," Jin-ho said. "That's not the same thing as quiet." She looked at me for a long moment, then really looked, the first time since the night with the envelope, and something in her face shifted, though she didn't say what. Taeyang showed up to that meeting expecting a man still bleeding from his father's death and a wife already gone from the paperwork. He got neither. Priya asked me once, in those last days before the council session, whether I was angrier at Taeyang or at Jin-ho, and I remember not having a clean answer for her. Taeyang's cruelty was, at least, uncomplicated a man who wanted something and was willing to use anyone's grief to get it. Jin-ho's failure was harder to sit with because it hadn't come from cruelty at all. It had come from a kind of love that had never been taught to ask permission. I have negotiated with people who hurt others on purpose and people who hurt others while convinced they were helping. And I can tell you honestly that the second kind is more dangerous, not less because they rarely see the damage coming, and they almost never believe you when you try to name it for them while it's happening. I spent one long night before the council session deciding what I actually wanted out of that room, because I have watched enough people confuse those two things to know the difference matters. Revenge would have meant walking in and destroying Taeyang publicly, humiliating him in front of the family, the way he'd tried to strip me out of it quietly, completely, without giving him a chance to answer for himself. Justice meant something narrower, and I decided, more durable. The truth on the record. The harm undone, where it could still be undone. And consequences that fit what he'd actually done, rather than what my 9 worst days wanted done to him. I chose justice. Not because I'd stopped being angry, but because I didn't want the first major decision of my marriage's second chapter to be one built on the same instinct to control an outcome that had nearly cost me the marriage in the first place. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not walk into that council chamber because I trusted my marriage was fixed. I walked in because I had spent 9 days assembling the only kind of case that has ever worked on men like Taeyang Yoon. Not accusations, not tears, evidence, laid out in the order a negotiator lays it out. Smallest leverage first, largest last, so that by the time he understood what was happening, there was no room left to talk his way backward out of it. The family council chamber sat beneath the same roof as the records room, panelled in the same dark wood, 12 chairs around a table that had settled business for this family for 3 generations. Madame Yoon sat at the head, black dress, hands folded, the same careful stillness I'd seen in my kitchen the night Jin-ho gave me those papers. Taeyang sat 2 seats down, composed, a folder in front of him. I recognized immediately the divorce petition, printed fresh, as if he intended to file it himself the second the will was read. The family attorney opened the sealed envelope and began reading Dae Sung-yoon's final instructions aloud. Board members I'd met exactly twice in 3 years leaned forward at the mention of joint operational control. One older man near the far end of the table, a cousin of Madame Yoon's whose name I'd never quite caught, muttered something in Korean too fast for me to follow and got a sharp look from Madame Yoon that ended it. I felt every eye in the room move to me at once, and I made myself sit as still as she did, hands folded the same way, because I had learned a long time ago that panic is contagious, and stillness is too. I watched Taeyang's face when the attorney reached the amended clause joint operational control, contingent on Jin-ho's marital status at time of reading, my name specified in his father's own hand. I watched the exact second he understood that the papers on the table in front of him, the divorce he'd spent 6 weeks engineering, weren't finalized, weren't even filed, because I had never signed them. "This is a formality," Taeyang said, too quickly. The marriage was already dissolving. Everyone in this room knows the paperwork was in motion. The paperwork, I said, and set Priya's audio transcript on the table, printed alongside the property registry filings for the Incheon warehouse complex, and the handwriting comparison, page by page, was in motion because you told my husband, 4 days before he handed it to me, that it was the only way to keep me from ending up dead in a family court fight you invented to cover an unauthorized deal with the Osan family. The room went very still. Madame Yoon's eyes moved from the papers to her nephew, and something shifted in her face that I recognized not surprise, exactly. Recalculation. You've been negotiating the Osan contracts independently, I continued, for 6 weeks, without board authorization, betting that Jin-ho would be too grief-stricken and too isolated from anyone who'd ask the right questions to notice before it was signed. The divorce wasn't protection. It was a clean field. You needed me gone from the paperwork so there'd be no one in this family left who'd read a warehouse registry before a wedding license. You're a negotiator, Taeyang said, sharp now, control slipping. Not family. You don't get to sit in this room and... I am sitting in this room, I said, and I let my voice go as calm and level as it's ever gone in a hostage stairwell. Because your uncle built a door for me 8 months before he died, specifically because he knew someone in this family would try to force me out of it. I didn't ask for a throne, Taeyang. I built a career deciding whether a room stays safe or falls apart, and I have decided this one stays safe. Starting now. He tried Madame Yoon next, softer, almost gentle. Aunt, you know better than anyone how confused Uncle's judgment became near the end. This clause, it isn't the man we knew. Grief and medication make people vulnerable to being led. Surely a court would see that too, if it came to that. It was, I would think later, his single worst mistake in a day full of them suggesting, out loud, in front of the man's own widow, that Dae Sung-yoon hadn't been of sound mind when he wrote a letter that named me by instinct, in his own cramped hand, 8 months before a stroke anyone had documented. Bring in Mr. Han, Madame Yoon said, without raising her voice. The steward had been waiting outside the chamber doors the entire session Jin-ho's doing, a quiet instruction I hadn't known about until that moment. He came in, hands folded, and confirmed for the board what he'd already told me in the pantry, that Dae-sung had filed the amendment himself, in full possession of his faculties, 8 months before his diagnosis, and had personally instructed Mr. Han that any efforts to suppress or circumvent the clause should be brought directly to the council, not handled quietly. He anticipated this exact meeting, Mr. Han said, looking not at Taeyang but at the table itself, the way a man looks at something sacred he's about to defend. He told me who might try it. He did not tell me it would be his own nephew. I wish, for the family's sake, he had been wrong. Taeyang turned to Jin-ho, one last card left to play. Cousin. You brought this outsider into a council meeting to accuse family of... I brought my wife into a council meeting, Jin-ho said, and it was the steadiest I'd heard him since the funeral, because you used my grief as a door into my father's business, and the only reason it worked as long as it did is that I let you convince me protecting her meant keeping her out of every room where the truth was being decided. I'm done doing that. To her or to this family. Madame Yoon spoke before anyone else could. Show me the registry filings, she said, and her voice had none of the coldness it carried in my kitchen. She read them in silence for a long minute, then set them down and looked at her nephew with an expression I would not have wanted turned on me. Your uncle trusted you with this family's security because he believed loyalty and ambition could coexist in you. I would like an explanation for why they no longer do. Taeyang didn't have one. Men like him rarely do, once the room stops being one they control. I understood, watching her, that some of what I'd mistaken for hostility toward me in my own kitchen had actually been something closer to fear. Fear of exactly this. A nephew maneuvering around her dying husband's instructions, and a daughter-in-law she hadn't yet decided she could trust enough to warn. She had chosen the wrong side of that fear for 9 days. I watched her choose the right one now, in front of the whole council, and it cost her something to do it publicly. I gave her that. It took the board 11 minutes to remove Taeyang from his security position, pending a full audit of the Osan negotiations. The audit, when it finished 6 weeks later, found enough irregularities to end not just his role, but his standing on the council entirely. No arrests, no public scandal, the family couldn't survive. Just a quiet, permanent closing of every door he'd used to reach as far as he had. The Osan deal itself was renegotiated under joint signature, mine and Jin-ho's, at terms considerably less generous to the family that had been counting on a grieving, isolated man to sign it alone. Taeyang didn't fight the audit's findings once the board's outside counsel finished presenting them. There was nothing left to fight with. He resigned his remaining committee seats before the family could vote to remove him from them, which Madame Yoon told me, without much sympathy, was the closest thing to an apology the man was constitutionally capable of giving. He moved to Busan that winter, took a minor position at a shipping firm with no family ties, and sent Jin-ho exactly one letter, unopened on Jin-ho's desk, the last I saw of it, which neither of us felt any urgency to read. Some doors, once closed properly, don't need to be reopened to prove a point. It took Jin-ho considerably longer most of that night, sitting across from me at our own kitchen island where this entire story started to say the thing I actually needed to hear. "I let someone tell me that loving you meant deciding for you," he said. "I am not going to do that again. Not with the business. Not with you. If we rebuild this, it has to be with both of us in every room, or it isn't worth rebuilding." I didn't forgive him that night. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one too often pretend forgiveness is instant, that love erases 9 days of being handed away like a liability. I told him the truth. That I needed him to prove, in small decisions, over months, that he'd actually learned the difference between protecting me and managing me, that trust rebuilds in receipts, not speeches. He nodded like a man who understood, for the first time, that the real cost of his mistake wasn't the business. It was this, right here, the distance between us at our own counter and the work it was going to take to close it. The months after weren't dramatic. That surprised me more than the council chamber had. He started bringing me into meetings I would once have only heard about second-hand, not as a courtesy, but because the joint signature clause meant my name was legally required on the page. He asked before he decided things now, even small things, even when it visibly cost him to slow down and ask instead of simply acting. Some nights it still felt like two people learning a new language in the ruins of a house they used to know by heart. I let it feel that way, because pretending otherwise would only have taught him that speeches still worked on me. Madame Yoon came to see me alone, 3 weeks after the council session, in the kitchen garden Jin-ho still watered before sunrise. She didn't apologize the way I'd imagined she might, in a single clean sentence. She sat on the low stone wall beside my rosemary and told me, instead, about the year she'd married into this family 26 years old, from a family with no standing the Yoons respected, watched by people who were waiting for her to fail so they could say they'd been right about her. I decided the only way to survive it was to become someone no one could accuse of softness, she said. I did not realize, until I watched you refuse to be quiet in that chamber, how much of that armor I had passed on to my son as though it were love. She didn't hand me an heirloom or a speech. She handed me a cutting from her own garden, a rose variety that had been in the family longer than the house had, and told me it needed a stubborn gardener to survive transplanting. I understood what she meant well enough not to make her say it twice. The Osan renegotiation protected 41 warehouse jobs that Taeyang's original terms would have quietly folded into a subcontracted shell company within the year a detailed Priya had flagged in the registry filings that none of us had thought to mention in the chamber, because it hadn't been necessary to win the room, only necessary to matter afterward. Priya took over as the family's outside compliance liaison that autumn, a formal role Jin-ho created specifically so no future transition in that house would ever again depend on one grieving man's judgment alone. 6 weeks later, I stood in the records room again this time with a key of my own, cut the week the board formally ratified the joint control clause. The divorce petition sat in the bottom drawer of the desk, stamped void in Priya's careful hand, not thrown away. I kept it there on purpose, beside the amended will, so I would never let myself forget how close I came to being written out of my own life by two men who thought they were protecting me by deciding for me. Jin-ho found me there at dusk, the way he had 9 days into this whole unraveling, except this time he didn't tell me I shouldn't be in the room. He held out a second key, the studies, and set it in my palm without a word. The last locked door in that house, finally open. Not because I'd taken it, but because he'd finally learned to hand it over. "No more rooms you can't walk into," he said. Later that night, I found him in the kitchen. The same island, the same 2 mugs, still unwashed, because some habits outlast even the worst 9 days of a marriage. He'd made tea instead of pouring a drink he wouldn't touch. He slid a mug across the stone to me the way he used to before any of this happened. And for a moment, it was almost possible to forget the envelope that had once sat exactly where the mug now stood. Almost. I didn't want to forget it completely. I wanted to remember it clearly enough to notice, every single day after, the difference between a man managing my life and a man building one beside me. I closed my hand around the key, warm from his palm, and let myself stand in that room a little longer than I needed to. 40 years of paper around us, most of it older than either of us, and somewhere in it, a dying man's decision that a family's real strength was never going to be its silence. It was going to be whoever refused to let that silence go unquestioned. I thought about the woman who'd stood in a kitchen doorway 9 weeks earlier, watching a car idle outside, believing for one terrible hour that she was being erased. She hadn't been erased. She'd been underestimated by a husband who mistook control for love, by a cousin who mistook her silence for weakness, and by a house full of people who didn't yet understand that a woman who talks armed men down for a living does not simply disappear because someone hands her an envelope and asks nicely. I didn't take his throne. I never wanted it. I just refused to let anyone decide, without me in the room, what I was allowed to keep. Would you have signed those papers the first night, to keep the peace, or made him say the truth out loud first, the way I did? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.